The webinar is now live. I'll be screen sharing. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event. I see that we are now letting everyone in and everyone's making themselves comfortable. So maybe panelists can turn on their videos.
All right. Hello, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Really excited to have this amazing panel with you, and just it's great to see. I think we've got about over 70 people on this video conference. So that's really telling to how important this topic is. So for the next hour, we're going to present a panel on asylum, and specifically asylum in crisis, upholding human rights during the pandemic. My name is Sunil Varghese. I'm the policy director at the International Refugee Assistance Project. And today we have three speakers to present to you this topic of how, through COVID 19, we've seen seismic changes worldwide with numerous countries, including the United States, where I'm speaking to you from, closing their borders and imposing strict restrictions on asylum seekers and other people, forced migrants, in purportedly attempt to contain the spread of the virus. So our discussion today will look at the effect of the coronavirus or the COVID-19 pandemic on the right to seek asylum, but also how it is affecting the plight of those who are displaced internally within the country's borders. We'll also look at the state of asylum both in the United States and in Europe writ large. So the plan today, I'm going to introduce to you our esteemed panelists, and then each of them will present some remarks, and then we'll go into questioning. And if you have the Zoom function available, feel free to go ahead and put your questions in the chat, or directly to myself, and I will present them as time goes. All right. And, uh, even though this is over Zoom, we would love for it to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to throw your thoughts, questions, suggestions, comments in the chat function, and we can address them in time. So first, I will introduce the panelists in the order that they'll go ahead and speak. First, we have Jaya Ramji Nagalis. So Jaya, if you can just say hi, so we can. Here we go. Jaya is the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at Temple University's Beasley School of Law. There, she teaches refugee law and policy and supervises the law school's Asylum project. She's the co author of Refugee Roulette Disparities in Asylum Adjudication and Proposals for Reform, which is an empirical study of adjudication at all four levels of the U.S. asylum system. In 2014, she co-authored Lives in the Balance, Asylum Adjudication by the Department of Homeland Security, which is a quantitative and qualitative study of asylum adjudication before DHS's asylum offices in the U.S. And I believe next year, in 2021, she's co-authoring a book titled The End of Asylum, which catalogs the Trump administration's efforts to destroy the asylum process in the United States, and also the book will make proposals on how to reconstruct the system. Next, we will have Afshan Khan, who's UNICEF's regional director for Europe and Central Asia. Afshan, if you can just say hello. There we go. She's also the special coordinator for the refugee and migrant response in Europe and is based in Geneva. Afshan has been an international public servant for over 28 years. Previously, she was the director of emergency programs for UNICEF and has held other senior positions, including the director of public sector alliances and resource mobilization, the associate regional director for Eastern and Southern Africa, and the UNICEF representative to Jamaica. She's had extensive field experience, including assignments in Kenya, Mozambique, DRC, and Colombia, and from 2012 to 2014, she took leave of the United Nations to become the CEO of Women for Women's International. In that role, she was responsible for setting the strategic vision and mobilizing the necessary resources for women rebuilding their lives after war. Happy to have her. Finally, we have Cecilia Jimenez Damari. Cecilia is a human rights lawyer specializing in forced displacement and migration. She has over 2 decades. Sorry, she has over 2 decades of experience in human rights advocacy for the Asia Pacific region, and also teaching experience as an adjunct professor of international human rights and humanitarian law. She previously acted as senior legal advisor and trainer with the International Displacement Monitoring Center of the Norwegian Refugee Council. and as the national director of the IDP, or the Internally Displaced Persons Project of the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. She was appointed special rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons by the Human Rights Council in September 2016. She assumed that mandate in November 2016 and serves in that role now. And we're honored to have her as well. So with that introduction, I want to give the floor to Jaya to start with looking at the asylum system and the asylum process in the United States.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks to the organizers of the conference, to Sunil for bringing us together, and of course to our co-panelists and for the wonderful audience turnout. It's great to see so many people here today. As Sunil said, I've been invited to speak about the US perspective and the US asylum system. So it's a very global North perspective. I'd like to start with the baseline understanding that by far the vast majority of refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced people are hosted in the global South. So this is a particular perspective from what was once a major receiving country and a very American perspective. So I'm excited to hear from my co-panelists to spread it out a little bit throughout the world. So asylum during the COVID pandemic, really from an international law perspective, has offered a breathtaking show of sovereign power, trumping, no pun intended, human rights treaty law and norms. And I just want to take a step back and start with a reminder that the pandemic response is layered over in the US and elsewhere, xenophobic nationalist politics. So the Trump administration's approach to the borders started well before the pandemic. The pandemic was a convenient excuse, or as Human Rights First and other folks have said, a pretext to close down the borders, right? Stephen Miller, one of Trump's main advisors, has really been trying to shut down the border to asylum seekers, and this was an opportunity to cement those restrictions. And I'm going to focus here on asylum. Trump's efforts to destroy the U.S. asylum system really began in earnest in 2008, right? His initial attempts were to shut down the refugee resettlement system. Once the Supreme Court approved his revised Muslim ban, he turned to the asylum process in 2018. So first of all, his administration attacked the substantive law, right, dismantling protections for women escaping domestic violence, and really all claims for based on persecution by non-state actors, gangs, cartels, domestic violence, right? These are the claims that many of the folks coming from Central America were making. Second, the administration also implemented new procedural obstacles, lots of bureaucratic hurdles, including, for example, rejecting asylum applications if any field is left blank in the 10-page form I-589, so just getting to the level of procedural bureaucratic ridiculousness, and working really hard to gut the immigration courts, right? Telling the judges they have to make decisions as quickly as possible, trying to decertify their union, all of these kinds of steps. So those are two of the prongs of the Trump administration attacks. The third, of course, relates most closely to the pandemic, which is excluding asylum seekers at the border. And so the Trump administration started by tightening standards for the credible fear process, which is what is applied to asylum seekers at the border, just to determine whether they have a baseline claim and can move forward into the asylum process. As discussed yesterday evening, and perhaps most famously, the horrific family separation policy that still has not ended. We still have, I think it's 545. Biden kept saying 525, but I think it's 545 kids whose parents can't be found. That many of those families were seeking asylum, and that was a deterrence policy, the most horrifying deterrence policy one could really possibly think of. There have been pushbacks into Mexico, a metering policy at the border where asylum seekers have to take a number and wait in line. We've had 2 asylum bans. The first for asylum seekers who entered without inspection, which was directly contradictory to the statute and was closed down pretty early, and then a ban on asylum for anyone who transited through a third country, including Mexico, and had failed to seek asylum in that country. Then, of course, which was also referenced in last night's debate, the migrant protection protocols, euphemistically known, which means that asylum seekers are sent back to Mexico to await their asylum hearings. Their asylum hearings are in tent courts, and they are now living, right, as Biden said, in pretty squalid conditions along the border, this outside one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Finally, these asylum cooperative agreements that Biden also mentioned with Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Agreeing with those countries that asylum seekers could be sent to those countries for their claims to be heard in their asylum systems, which are essentially non-existent. They're really, really not functioning. The Guatemala agreement is the only one that's in force right now, and people have been sent back through that process. And then finally, PACER and HARP, which are these super expedited processes at the border. So that's what was happening before the pandemic. And 2020, of course, provided an opportunity to realize Trump and Miller's goal of shutting out asylum seekers entirely. So we saw all of these COVID turnbacks starting in March of 2020. That the administration refused entry to nearly all immigrants under the CDC order. This included asylum seekers. In July of this year, they issued a proposed rule to bar asylum and withholding removal specifically to anyone who is from or traveled through a country where an infectious disease is prevalent. And finally, just last month, another proposed rule to expel anyone who poses a risk of spreading a quarantinable communicable disease. All of this without the usual protections we see for asylum withholding removal, but we saw an exception for temporary workers in agricultural and non-agricultural fields. The State Department describing these migrants as mission critical and a national security priority, right? So we see that we can actually let in some folks if they're working in fields that Americans might not want to take jobs in. Also a deluge of proposed rules over the summer that I won't go into. But so these COVID closures, the US is not alone. So the numbers I found were that 167 countries have closed their borders, and at least 57 make no exception for asylum seekers. So we see this real challenge here, the rise of sovereignty, and really the right, people were talking before this about whether sovereignty was on the wane. Sovereignty is definitely not on the wane, right? It's in full force right now. So Sunil, you asked us also to speak a little bit about what reasonable but responses might look like and what a new normal could look like, right? And again, starting from my premise, right, hopefully what this could look like under an administration that's not xenophobic and nationalist and takes human rights and asylum seriously. So what could we see? We could see COVID testing, right? We're a wealthy country, we're able to do that. We could see quarantining. We could see, importantly, protection of asylum seekers and other migrants in detention. I don't have time to get into it in my talk, but it's really been horrifying to see what's happened in those detention centers. And also, early in the pandemic, we were deporting people to Guatemala who had tested positive when that country had a very, very low COVID rate. So we were actually spreading COVID to other countries. And so these are things that we should not be doing. So and finally, how human rights law, of course, might come into play, because that's the focus of the panels. And here I want to think in particular, right? So thinking about asylum seekers, of course, but also thinking about undocumented migrants more generally, because the line between undocumented and migrants and asylum seekers, refugees is thin. So folks who are scared to seek healthcare and excluded from social protection measures, right? We need to worry about that. We need to worry about the gendered impacts of this pandemic, domestic violence, right? Already being a huge problem, and has gotten much worse in quarantine. I was just speaking to a scholar from Mexico earlier this week who said they've already seen a huge increase in femicide and domestic violence in Mexico. Other places, we just don't have the numbers yet, but we're going to see that coming. Also, stranded migrant workers, right? Migrant workers who spent time working abroad have been excluded from social supports and then can't get home, right? These are folks we should be worried about. And then migrants who are returning home, right? Both domestic, right, who were in different parts of a country, or who were overseas and who are returning home. So for all of these folks, we need to think hard about restrictions on free movement and other emergency restrictions. And human rights law gives us a way to think about that, right? To think about any of these restrictions should be lawful, should be strictly necessary, should be proportionate, should be time-bound, should be justified by legitimate public health objectives. They should be subject to review, and they should be non-discriminatory, right? This is the meaningful language that human rights law gives us, that we should put into play. And under a framework that looked like that, we should be able to continue allowing asylum seekers into the country. There are a lot more areas in which human rights law might come into play. I don't have time to go into all of them, but just to mention, right, the right to life, right, it is important here. The right to health, right, as mentioned in the abstract for this panel, we have to think about including migrants in that. The right to an adequate standard of living, to water, to sanitation, particularly for migrants and asylees and refugees living in camps. And maybe this is even an opportunity to push forward some economic rights, to preserve jobs and wages, enable shelter, and ensure migrants are included in social services, especially education for children of migrants. And so I guess I will close with my hope is that, right, we have not seen this so far because of the leadership we have right now, but this is actually an opportunity for some form of global solidarity, and hopefully that's a way forward. So thank you so much, and I will turn it over to my co-panelists.
Thank you, Jayed. That was frightening, but very instructive. And it's very interesting to see where we've come from and where we might go. Afshan, if you can speak to us, perhaps, from your perspective, and maybe touching on what is happening in Europe recently.
Thank you, Sunil, for the opportunity to speak about the situation of refugee and migrant children in Europe. And I think particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as under the proposed European Union policies on migration. So I think to set it in a bit of context, for years across the southern Mediterranean migration routes, authorities have been under extreme pressure to respond to the rights and needs of migrants and asylum seekers, including children. Just to give a sense of the figures, just in 2019, the last year for which annual statistics are available, more than 25% of the over 120,000 refugees and migrants who reached Europe through the Mediterranean were children. And this equates to 51,000 refugee and migrant children, and 28% of these children were unaccompanied, or for other reasons required immediate humanitarian assistance and longer-term social support. So the social inclusion pathways, primarily in Greece, Italy, and Balkans, is what I'm going to be speaking to. 8,000 children, in other words, 22 children a day, arrived at Europe's borders. And unaccompanied and having traveled alone or having become separated from their families along the way. And I think when we look at the context, particularly of these children, we're underestimating the levels of trauma and the level of, I don't know the level of trauma that they've experienced along this journey. So there's been a continuing child rights crisis that's been greatly exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Border closures and other policies taken in response to the pandemic have resulted in countries along Europe's southern borders being increasingly unable to accommodate the scale and needs of these children, and children who have arrived since this period as well. We've not necessarily seen a slowdown, particularly in Italy, for example, as a result of the crisis in Libya. So this has led to some short-term solutions that do not meet international or regional child rights legal standards. For example, only 38% of the more than 5,400 unaccompanied children in Greece benefit from adequate care arrangements. and 36% have been residing in really deplorable conditions outside of a safe and protective environment. In plain language, that means hundreds of unaccompanied children are spending the night out in the open or are homeless and are subject to living on the streets. Some have been put in detention facilities simply because of a lack of a suitable alternative and the inability to provide appropriate accommodation for these children has meant that prison-like facilities are often the norm. The border closures across Europe and along migration routes have also left children stuck at borders and in unsafe and temporary accommodation centers with no place to go. And this has made them increasingly vulnerable to brutal incidents along some of the border areas, including violent behavior by border guards, degrading treatment, theft of their belongings, and really physical violence. The imposition of some of the health and quarantine measures have also left children in closed facilities, stranded on boats or in unsafe conditions for extended periods of time. And they were thus really deprived of necessary services and lacking protection measures. So Jaya spoke to some of the needs for social protection and education, and these have been lacking. The processing of asylum claims and legal protections, relocations, and resettlement efforts have also been slowed by bureaucratic delays and operational challenges. So to give you some idea of these, in the European context, the pandemic has also really triggered a heightened sense of urgency, political action, and some solidarity as well in the EU to support particularly vulnerable refugee and migrant children. Germany, Portugal, France, and others have made some significant efforts and pledges to relocate large numbers of children, especially from Greece. This was largely as a result of the latest fire in Moria. And Greece has been particularly overwhelmed, I think, given their own economic woes over the past few years by the influx of refugees and migrants. So in a way, the devastating fires in Moria, which was the largest refugee camp in Europe at the time, has led to, in a sense, I think, a different take on the crisis, or in this case, maybe multiple crises, as an opportunity to really break through a political impasse and perhaps, in a way, advance the fundamental rights of children in a different way than we had expected. So I'd like to take a few moments to reflect a bit on the European Commission's new proposed pact on migration, which has been developed and launched for discussion among member states. And it's obviously subject to further negotiations. And it's largely been brought, I think, accelerated moving forward because of the Moria fire and the fact that something different needed to be done. So in that sense, the proposed EU Pact on Migration is both sweeping and ambitious. I think it's also very much a product of political compromise. And we have to understand that because there needed to be a broader consensus amongst many of the EU member states. The Pact's explicit protections that exempt unaccompanied children and families with children under 12 from border procedures is clearly an improvement on the current system. Ideally, at UNICEF, we would like to see protections extended to all children, but the kids under 12 is already somewhat of an improvement. Proposals in the pact also expand child protection safeguards, and these are in a number of important ways. These include committing to child-specific procedures, proposing a unified and transferable approach to international protections, expanding the use of guardians, increasing parameters for family reunification, and elevating the best interest of determination as the primary systematic driver of considerations, particularly for unaccompanied children. So we see that very much as an improvement on the current procedures. The provisions also aim at increased solidarity for relocation of vulnerable children and families. Again, something Jaya spoke to, and this is something that is important because this will remain a critical tool, both as part of the standard procedure, as well as in the event of a further crisis. So this will help countries on Europe's external borders adequately to both process, protect, and extend services to all children in migration contexts. So UNICEF, in a way, is pleased to see the inclusion of proposals for concrete and measurable benchmarks to improve service provision for children in migration, including enrollment into schools. And we see this as a critical element within 2 months of lodging an asylum application. So that's minimum standard, and benchmark is an important element of the new pact. We're also strongly welcoming the inclusion of proposed measures for independent monitoring of border procedures and asylum processes. We think that's crucially important. And this remains a key tool to support transparency and aid the principled implementation of the pact itself. So we see this external monitoring as a really, really important element. It holds governments accountable for some of these minimum standards. At the same time, we have some concerns that the rules may increase reliance on closed facilities, even for families with children, as they go through screening, through border, asylum, or return procedures. Significant investments into reception capacity and care are going to be required if these minimum standards are going to be adhered to. The PAC's proposal to expedite return procedures, which is also there, must be complemented by a renewed emphasis on procedural and legal standards for children and safeguards. We see this as crucial. And in cases where return has been found to be in the best interest of children, there again, we think their rights and needs must also be reflected and met in readmission agreements during return operations. And when providing reintegration support and assistance, this also has to be created as part of a comprehensive policy. We know that the pact also presents an opportunity to further prioritize children in the EU's financial partnerships with third countries. And we think this is an important element of ensuring the safe reintegration and return. There are some mutual benefits for putting children first in terms of channeling EU development assistance into national education, child and social protection services, and this has not been the case systematically across the board to date. So we really welcome that opportunity as well. I think when we look at COVID-19 and its the pandemic and what it presents the world with, while it presents the world with some enormous challenges, paradoxically, I think it may have hastened the formulation of the EU Migration Pact. It offers an opportunity to kind of fundamentally reshape some of the children's migration agenda going forward, and create experiences and opportunities to integrate and thrive in Europe and beyond for decades to come. So in a sense, I think we may have seen a bit of a confluence of factors to have an opportunity to better apply some of the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child for every child, given both the COVID pandemic, which is one element, the circumstances in Greece and the Moria fire. And we really think that there is an opportunity now to push on the Convention of the Rights of the Child with a core commitment for every member state in Europe to pick up on this agenda and take it forward in a constructive way. Whether the EU will politically be able to navigate the interests of the many different member states remains to be seen, but I do think as an agency, we're ready to accompany them on this journey and make sure we get something that's in the best interest of every child. Thanks, Sunil. Back to you.
Thank you, and that was very helpful. And speaking from someone stateside, it's hard to hear everything that's happening in the United States, but also keep track of similar and maybe somewhat dissimilar developments in Europe. And we definitely were all kind of tragically watching the fire in Moria and then this new migration pact. So appreciate that, especially how you kind of focused on the impact on children and unaccompanied children. Next, we have Cecilia, who's going to be talking about internally displaced persons. So until now, we've been generally talking about asylum seekers who generally have left their country of origin and are seeking protection to another government for the reason that they're a refugee. Different from that are internally displaced persons, as Cecilia will explain, who have not left their country of origin. Cecilia does have two PowerPoint slides that will be on your screen during her presentation. Cecilia?
Thank you so much, Sunil, and thanks very much to the organizers for this invitation. Hello again, Jaya and Afshan. I have two slides which I would like to show. The first one now, in order that we know who we are talking about. And I would like to reference the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement. It's an international soft law document that puts together 30 principles, most of which are actually binding international law principles. Now, the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement provides that who is an IDP, and these are persons or groups of persons, you can read it. And the important thing is they have been forced or obliged to leave their homes or places of habitual residence. It is not voluntary, and therefore they are not migrants. And this is as a result or because to avoid effects of armed conflict, situations of violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters. So in a way, you will see that the definition is actually covers already a good part of people who may seek asylum outside the countries, and they may have been formerly internally displaced persons. On the other hand, the definition, and it's a descriptive definition, is also broader. And because this could also be people who have fled their homes or obliged to do so because of the hazards, sudden onset or slow onset hazards of climate change, for example. In fact, my report to the General Assembly, which I just presented 2 days ago, was about human rights of IDPs within the context of climate change hazards. And as Sunil has said, they have not crossed an internationally recognized border. So let's make sure we know that definition. And next slide, please, so that we have the global situation. These are figures from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and we will already see that as far as violence and armed conflict are concerned, there are actually already more people who are refugees or even asylum seekers throughout the world, and they remain within their countries. And unfortunately, in 2018, there were new displacements, and you see the numbers on your screen. But I would also like to point out that there is an unknown number of IDPs due to other causes, such as development projects. Now, we are talking about the situation of human rights of these vulnerable people within the COVID-19 2020 pandemic. And actually, if you will just look at new displacements since the pandemic started, we already have close to 1 million new IDPs, despite or maybe because of the COVID. And I would like to point out that most of the reasons for these are the armed conflict with regard to attacks by non-state armed groups and the ensuing military operations that happen. So you can take down the slides now. Thank you, Eric. Now, what is really important here, now that we know who we are talking about and what is the situation, is that in my work as a UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons and the terrific work that people are doing on the ground working with IDPs, we have come to the conclusion that internally displaced persons have also been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, which is worsening existing protection and human rights problems that IDPs already had and are creating new ones. Now, I mentioned about new attacks. COVID-19 has not stopped attacks against the civilian or the need for people to flee. And the latest evidence actually that suggests that it has increased by 2.5% since the pandemic began. And the data from the ground shows that displacement are reporting, the protection clusters are reporting that because of displacement, these are actually due to escalating conflict, political instability, and increasing cases of violence because of COVID-19. And these includes attacks on civilians and humanitarians themselves. Ashfran has spoken about children, and I would like to also emphasize that IDPs are not the same all throughout the world. It really depends on the causes of their displacement, but also if you will break down the nature of the population, you would also have to break it down according to the specific human rights of certain groups within it. Children is just one. We also have women, etc. And if we're talking about women, I would like to also share that gender-based violence is increasing exponentially. 24 out of 26 of national protection clusters worldwide report increases in the number of gender-based violence cases. And GBV experts actually project that for every 3 months that the lockdown continues, an additional 15 million women and girls could experience gender-based violence. An additional 13 million child marriages could take place that otherwise would have occurred between 2020 and 2030. Now, this is really undermining efforts to curb the spread of protection, and they're triggering new displacements, reducing safe access to vital health and sanitation services, and impeding life-saving protection. We're talking about this as human rights and not merely as humanitarian and protection concerns. Much of these, unfortunately, is happening with a complete level of impunity. On the other hand, in addition, rather, xenophobia, racism, and stigmatization are also on the rise. According to the Global Protection Cluster, increased stigmatization, including attacks against displaced and other marginalized people accused of spreading the virus, is occurring in 85% of internal displacement context. Now, I know that I'm talking more to an international audience who are based more in the developed countries. So this may seem very far, but actually, if you will look at it, you can also see that there are wars and violence and conflict in different parts of the world. And if you see that in the news, think about the consequence, and one big consequence are always displacement. In the end of the day, IDPs are being denied their human rights, and many of the clusters, protection clusters, actually also report restrictions on freedom of movement. And some report unsafe or forced movement, and this is occurring with the high impact due to COVID-19. I'd like to go to my third point, and not just describing the situation inside and the lack of human rights and restriction of human rights, but my third point is this is also actually affecting the relationship of being an internally displaced person and migration or asylum. You know, I went to Libya and in many other countries. And in many of those countries, people were actually telling me that if their particular governments and states do not actually exert effective efforts to protect them or maybe return them to where they are, this is what we in the humanitarian sector call durable solutions, they would cross the sea and maybe become migrants. And if they are fleeing from violence and armed conflict, they may even become refugees. That relationship is broken. That link is broken because, of course, because of the pandemic, we have travel restrictions which have been imposed and borders that have been closed. And as Jaya has already said, you know, there is increasing ban on asylum. This is really an important point that we look at the sources of where many of the migrants and refugees are coming from. And in fact, the global compacts on migration and refugees, respectively, have actually flagged the importance of prevention. Now, what do we do with international law? I mean, I think it's really important to affirm, first of all, that international law, human rights law, and international humanitarian law, let's not forget that when it comes to armed conflict, applies to IDPs. And this applies in its totality. And I would like to also, since I'm an advocate of transitional justice, not only with regard to the civil and political rights and economic, social, cultural rights, but also with regard to many mechanisms, including transitional justice. These are based on international law. And of course, in terms of application, constitutional law and the implementation of treaty law obligations. We need to insist that the rights of internally displaced persons to participate as citizens of their countries, making their voices heard and ensuring they have a platform to speak, are actually upheld. The important mechanisms, sometimes we already have them in many countries, but I would like to put a stress on the importance of having internal displacement protection laws for IDPs. And El Salvador, just a few months ago, actually adopted a new law protecting IDPs. I went to El Salvador in 2017, and these were IDPs who fled because of gang violence. That they are also qualified, if you want, to be described as internally displaced persons. El Salvador has recognized them. Niger is the same, etc. Mexico just passed a draft at the Chamber of Deputies, recognizing international human rights application to IDPs within their countries. Mozambique is also a case in waiting. I can go on, but I'll stop there. And since we're talking about international law, for those who are concerned with Africa, of course, we need the ratification and implementation of the Kampala Convention. Last but not the least is the use of mechanisms, be it at national protective mechanisms, regional level, or international level. And these need to include not only the protection of human rights per se, but also access to legal documentation, access to procedures of complaints, protection mechanisms, particularly for gender-based violence, etc. And the important thing I would like to emphasize here is really the direct application of international human rights law within the country, and to ensure that the international community and the country concerned recognizes that. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, and that was very illuminating. We've appreciate everyone's questions in the Q&A and chat. I don't know if we'll have time to get to all of them, but one of the kind of general themes throughout several of the questions is how countries can balance both protection of public health, protection of international health obligations, but also their international human rights obligations and domestic protections for migrants. I guess starting with the USJF, can you just kind of touch on that balance and what are folks recommending, and where do you see like what do you think is the best course of action? And then Afshan, if you can do the same for Europe, and Cecilia, maybe if you can talk about IDPs in the context of the pandemic, that could be helpful.
Great, thanks, Sunil. So I think in the U.S., obviously we're a country, and this is what the people I've been reading have been talking about. We're a country that can afford to test, and so we should be able to test people. We shouldn't be shutting down the borders to folks who need protection. And I think the main way I think about it in the U.S. is we're putting people in more dangerous situations than they are. So there's been, to my understanding, some COVID, but that hasn't been a major outbreak in the camps along the southern border, but obviously putting people in situations where they're living in tents, they don't have sufficient access to water, let alone soap, right? I've been reading the stories of these folks who say, you tell me I'm supposed to be washing my kids' hands all the time, but I can't even get access to water. So just using our resources to ensure that folks are safe and to provide humanitarian protections for them. And I think also really thinking about detention and whether people need to be detained, because you are putting both the asylum seekers and immigrants who are detained at risk, but you're also, right, in those detention centers, you're creating risks that can spread to the broader population. So, right, thinking about it from both perspectives, it's just not a good idea. And right, we have opportunities, right? So people can quarantine, they can stay with family members, right? There are other ways that we can approach what's happening that don't have to be so draconian, but can still prevent public health. And I would say there's a lot of there's a lot of thoughtful research out there about it, right? The group of public health officials wrote a letter to the Trump administration saying this is not the way we should approach the situation. We need to be thoughtful. We need to be careful. Certainly, if someone tests positive, we need to think carefully about letting them in. But we can perform the testing and uphold our humanitarian obligations at the same time that we're respecting public health.
Thank you. And in Europe, you touched on how this is affecting children. Is there anything else you want to add in terms of balancing, Afshan, in terms of balancing this kind of, sovereign right or sovereign responsibility of public health and kind of international human rights obligations as well?
Sure. I think first of all, we've got to remember that the numbers in Europe are relatively modest in terms of entry because there's been such a strong lockdown on the borders. And the pandemic hit Europe and it hit Europe hard, but largely amongst the resident population in these countries, very few cases amongst the refugee and migrant populations that were already resident in that country. And that's largely because of the European demographic, which has many of the countries in Europe with largely elderly populations. So I think when we come to, what are some of the solutions for balancing the asylum procedures with the public health measures of international concern, clearly Jaya has spoken to them. Their measures around testing, their measures around quarantine. But I do think it's important to bust a myth that that the COVID situation is more prevalent amongst the refugee and migrant population, because it isn't. The availability of services, clean water, facilities for hand washing, masks, and all of the prevention measures that we're calling for amongst the general population also need to be applied amongst the refugee and migrant population. And that therefore means making those services available. And that includes distance and remote learning for kids so they don't lose out on school. So to me, it's really a question of having essential services available to all populations and making sure that if it's a case of making a choice between, are we risking letting in a positive case of COVID, then you do test and you do quarantine for a couple of weeks. But I think upholding humanitarian principles is critical here. And some of the actions we've seen with the rescue boats not letting people off board because of fears of COVID are basically unjustifiable. And I think that's where these measures need to be put in place. Search and rescue operations need to continue, and disembarkation has to be allowed, with a particular focus on women and children disembarking first.
Got it. Thank you. There's also a few questions here on a topic I'm not familiar with, so I'm very curious as to what the panelists are thinking. This idea of diplomatic asylum, basically where someone seeks, seeks protection in an embassy or consulate or of another country, and the example in the chat was maybe of Julian Assange, who sought protection, I believe, in the embassy of Ecuador. I think that's correct. And just basically, like, maybe discussing that. And the specific question was, does the sensationalization or attention that diplomatic asylum gets, like, what is the effect of that on kind of the general framework and support for asylum? Does anyone want to jump in on diplomatic asylum?
Yeah, I can jump in. I have to say I don't have a lot to say about it. It is not really existent in the US at this point, because we have both an asylum process where people who arrive in the US can seek protection, and a refugee resettlement process, which is not functioning so well these days. But the idea is that people who are designated as refugees can be brought to the US. And I think diplomatic asylum is kind of right. People think about that in terms of the US, at least, as Cold War memories of the Cold War, but that just doesn't happen so much in the US context these days. And I think the Assange situation, I don't personally think, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, Sunil, as well. I don't think it's had a lot of impact on the US asylum system, or there are challenges of politicization, but I don't think it's really resonated with the system. And that's absolutely part of the reason the system was, why Congress created the system, because you need to have a process, right, an orderly process, so that it doesn't start to look like that's exactly what Congress was reacting to in 1980 when it passed the Refugee Act. You don't want a situation where people are let in one by one on an ad hoc basis. You want a situation where right, the rule of law comes into play, and we can make fair and reasonable decisions about who merits protection in the U.S.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. It is interesting. I can just say from the U.S. perspective, and as an outsider, maybe I'm seeing this from in Europe as well. But much of the attacks on asylum often stem from public sentiment going one way or the other. In the United States, I can't say to the person that the Assange case really was sensational enough that it swung the tide on the restrictions of asylum in the U.S. However, there are other episodes, such as media attention around quote unquote caravans, much of the rhetoric behind the uh, Trump's first presidential campaign in 2015, 2016, that led to the Muslim ban and much of the rhetoric around the border wall. I, again, as an outsider, have seen similar rhetoric when large numbers of refugees were came into Europe and principally Germany, and I'm seeing some commentary on how some of the migration pact is kind of a response to that. So I think it is correct, this idea that it is oftentimes restrictions on asylum stem from events that get a lot of public attention. But I don't think diplomatic asylum is one that, at least in the U.S., we've seen kind of get a lot of attention. Is that somewhat true in your work with either IDPs or in Europe, Rafshan? That was for Cecilia, Rafshan.
Cecilia, do you want to go ahead?
Sorry, is that me? Okay, thank you. Well, of course, I'm talking about internally displaced persons. I'm not talking about asylum. I'm talking about the situations where asylum seekers come from and where refugees come from. And this is also one reason why human rights advocates like me really try to advocate for the application of human rights and international human rights law in the countries themselves, not to deprive people of getting or applying for asylum or refugees. But I think that we do need a balanced approach concerning application of human rights, not only to where people go, but to where people come from. And with regard to the pandemic, just going back to the issue that Sunil has mentioned with regard to the pandemic, I spoke a lot about the effects of pandemic on the human rights of IDPs, but really it is for many of us a question of internally displaced persons having equal rights to the rest of the population and affirmative rights because of their displacement. They do experience a lot of stigmatization and discrimination because they are displaced. And this is really why we put an emphasis on access to not only humanitarian actors, but also legal and human rights actors. And they have been deprived even before the pandemic. And unfortunately, because of the pandemic, the inequality that they have already been experienced before has actually been exacerbated. And so this is why we need to step up on their protection as people who are objects and subjects of human rights.
Great, thank you. And I see we're at 11:30. I really want to just first say thank you to the both the audience. There's been a lively Q&A. There's at least almost a dozen open questions that hopefully that stays open and I can try to answer some of those, and perhaps the organizers can kind of capture those and we can answer those later. But sorry that we couldn't get to all the questions, but that's just a sign on how important and interesting this topic is. I want to give a special thank you to our really esteemed panelists, Jaya, Afshan, and Cecilia. It's really great to hear such a diverse and valuable perspective. So thank you. And thank you to the audience. And I believe there is people have signed up for the next session. So thank you, and we're signing off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.